Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Grace Wilkins, and I am the Vice President of Operations of the Dartmouth Political Union. On behalf of the DPU, I'd like to welcome you to Capitalism versus Democratic Socialism, an expert debate on political philosophies. Founded in 2018, the DPU is Dartmouth's preeminent, nonpartisan, student-led political organization dedicated to fostering open discourse and challenging preconceptions. To this end, we host speakers from across the political spectrum, organize both student and expert debates, and hold campus-wide discussions on issues that matter most. Our event tonight is the second in the series of expert debates entitled the DPU Debate Series, Critical Discourse in the Age of Disagreement, which will take place throughout this academic year. This series tackles some of the most pressing and controversial topics facing our nation and the world, fostering respectful conversations about the issues that truly matter. This initiative has been brought to campus with the support of the Office of the President and Dartmouth Dialogues. Tonight's event would not have been possible without the support of our donors, the Office of the President and the Office of Student Life, particularly President Bylock, Senior Advisor Drynan, and Assistant Dean McKenna. Thank you. Before introducing our moderator, and our debaters, I'd like to share the results of a poll conducted with the in-person audience, following the monk-style debate format. As of right now, 42.4% of you believe that capitalism best promotes economic justice, individual freedom, and social responsibility, while 57.6% of you disagree. Furthermore, 78.3% of you are open to reconsidering your position. We'll poll the audience again at the end of the debate to see if anyone's mind has changed. Now for the reason you all are here. Mac Mahoney, who will be moderating our debate tonight, is the president of the Dartmouth Political Union and a member of the class of 2026, studying politics, philosophy, and economics. Dr. Cornel West, affectionately known to many as Brother West, is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Chair at Union Theological Seminary. Dr. West teaches on the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as well as courses in the philosophy of religion, African American critical thought, and a wide range of subjects, including, but by no means limited to, the classics, philosophy, politics, cultural theory, literature, and music. He is passionate about communicating with diverse audiences to keep alive the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy rooted in truth, love, and justice. Dr. West is the former professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and professor emeritus at Princeton University. A graduate of Harvard, where he finished magna cum laude in 3 years, Dr. West earned both his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton. He is the author of 20 books and the editor of 13 more, including Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. Professor Robert George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He has frequently served as a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, teaching philosophy of law and other related subjects. Beyond academia, Professor George has served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and held appointments on the President's Council on Bioethics and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He was also the U.S. representative on UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Science and Technology. A graduate of Swarthmore College, Professor George earned advanced degrees in law and philosophy at both Harvard and Oxford, where he was a Frank Knox Fellow. He has authored and edited numerous works, including Making Men Moral in Defense of Natural Law, The Clash of Orthodoxies, and Conscience and Its Enemies. His scholarship has appeared in leading law reviews and publications, and he has received numerous honors, including the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal. Please join me in giving Mac, Professor West, and Professor George a warm welcome tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you, Grace. We originally had an idea of doing time limits for questions, but I was assured that that probably would not be best. So we're actually just going to learn all of the wisdom that these two have and just kind of let them go at it. And I'll interrupt as needed. So I think we should just jump right in, right? Let's get our money's worth. So a couple of years ago, in an NPR interview together, the host asked you, Professor George, for an example of where you and Cornel West disagree, even when Cornel asks the right questions. You said that you come to different answers about economic systems, and you praised Professor West for asking the critical question, not just whether a system lifts people out of poverty, but whether it is also just. Could you first begin our conversation by describing your friendship, despite having these different political views and world outlooks, as well as your differing answers to these questions of economic systems? Professor West, could you start?
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so used to Brother Robbie going first, but I will. First, I just want to say I'm blessed to be here. I'm blessed to be back. This is consecrated space for me. I taught here many a time, especially the summer of 2017. And when I think back of the rich legacy of Dartmouth, I say to myself, ooh, we've got something to build on because we're living in a deep moment of spiritual decay and unbelievable moral decadence where more and more we're seeing organized greed and weaponized hatred and routinized indifference to the vulnerable, which means that it's a challenge to each and every one of us. So it's not a question of ism. It's a question of what kind of human being you choose to be in the short time from the move from your mama's womb to tomb. What kind of force for good will you be in the short time that you are here? So Brother Robbie and I, this is my dear brother, even when he's wrong. My very dear brother. I love my brother. I respect my brother. He's got integrity and honesty, even when we have deep disagreements, because we understand that love is so much deeper than just political agreement. And that genuine brotherhood, sisterhood, siblinghood, and friendship is so much more profound than agreeing on a political analysis, even though it's nice to be right. And I'm not a relativist. Somebody's right and somebody's wrong about this thing. But I do just want to acknowledge the degree to which Dartmouth has played a role in my own shaping, and I'm blessed to be here with my magnificent, beloved wife, Anahita. I was telling her about the times here with Donald Pease and Barbara Wheel and Jed Dobson. I mean, those are magnificent moments for me when I think about Dartmouth, even though it's usually pretty cold up here, but I taught in the summertime. But when we think about debates, you know, this is not a winner-take-all horse race. We are two cracked vessels trying to make sense of the world, preserve our integrity, honesty, and dignity in a world that looks as if it is collapsing. Not just in the United States, but around the world. And so in that sense, much is at stake. It's not a matter of just who wins and who loses. We're in it together. And somehow we've got to muster the courage to tell the truth, not just to powers that be, not just to oppressed peoples, but to ourselves. Truth is a jagged edge, as Herman Melville says. Of course, he had a house just down the road, didn't he? Western Virginia, Massachusetts, just like our dear brother Matt.
Yeah.
Straight out of Western. You and Melville, that's a nice idea, isn't it?
Sure.
Absolutely. But let me stop there, though, Brother Robbie. You can jump right in.
Well, thank you, Mac. And like Brother Cornel, I want to thank the Political Union and the co-sponsors for the opportunity to be here. I've been, I think, twice before on the Dartmouth campus, but most recently, at least 15 or 20 years ago, and it's a real pleasure to be back here. And of course, it's always a very great blessing when I can be with my dear brother, Cornel West, America's premier public intellectual on any accounting, from whom I've learned so much and whose brothership has been one of the great blessings of my life. You asked about that friendship and how it began. Back in the 90s, when we were both professors at Princeton, we were in some faculty seminars together. We had overlapping interests in moral and political philosophy, and other subjects, but we didn't know each other well. We came to know each other well only in 2005, when a student named Andrew Perlmutter, very good student, who was a student in Brother Cornel's classes and a student in my class, came to my office hours and said that he and some of his friends we're starting a new student publication on campus to be called The Green Light. And it was going to be our own campus version of The New Yorker, as he described it. A journal of arts, culture, literature, politics, highbrow. And I said, well, that sounds very exciting and very good. It'll be a real contribution to our campus, I'm sure. How can I help you? And he said, well, as a regular feature of the magazine, we're going to have an interview in which one professor here at Princeton interviews another professor, and that will begin with our inaugural issue. And for that inaugural issue, we've asked Professor Cornel West to be the interviewer, and he's agreed to do that. And we invited him to suggest someone that he would like to interview, and he said that he would like to interview you. So would you be willing to be interviewed by Professor West? Well, I was very flattered. I was not a very well-known person, but Brother West was already probably the most well-known figure, nationally, internationally known figure on the Princeton faculty. So I said, well, of course, I'll be delighted to engage with Professor West in a discussion for the magazine. Well, the appointed day came, and here came Andrew with his tape recording machine, an old-fashioned cassette player. Some of you of a certain age will remember those. And a photographer who must have taken about 1,000 shots over the course of our conversation. We were supposed to talk for an hour. And halfway through, when the cassette tape clicked off, Andrew jumped up and waved his hands and said, don't say anything, and flipped the tape back over and said, go. Well, we were really at it. We talked about all sorts of philosophical issues, concrete political issues, going back and forth, agreeing on some, disagreeing on some. But we were into it so hot and heavy, by the time that hour ended and the tape flipped off again and there was no more tape, we were beyond stopping. So we continued to talk and discuss and debate for another 3 hours. And then finally I noticed on my watch that it was 6 o'clock and I needed to be home for dinner. So I said, Brother Cornel, this has just been such a wonderful conversation. We really need to get to know each other better. We really need to get together more often than we have in the past. Let's carry on this conversation another time. Let's get together for a meal. And he said, oh, that would be wonderful, Brother Robbie, we'll do that. And then we walked down together to where my car was parked, right near the Princeton University Press on William Street. And I stood there with my hand on the latch for another half hour or 45 minutes because we couldn't stop debating. We couldn't stop talking about these issues. Finally, I realized that my wife was probably going to call the police and report a missing person if I didn't show up. So I said, Cornel, I really got to go, and off I went. But shortly thereafter, we got a note. The senior members of the faculty got a note from the dean of the college saying, we need more senior members of the faculty to teach our freshman seminars. We advertise those to our incoming students, to our prospective students, and we tell them that they'll be taught at Princeton by full professors and famous professors, but not enough of our senior faculty are teaching these. Will you teach them? Teach one. So I immediately got in touch with Professor West and said, Cornel, should we just carry on this conversation together that we began with a group of 16 or 18 brilliant young Princeton freshmen, which we did, and the magic began then. We found ourselves in the classroom together, teaching great works of literature and philosophy, going all the way back to Sophocles. We began with the Antigone, and then we read Plato's dialogue, Gorgias, and then we read St. Augustine's Confessions, and all the way up into the 19th century with John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx, and the 20th century with Friedrich Hayek and John Dewey and C.S. Lewis. And it was the most wonderful experience. And so we carried on doing that until Cornel abandoned me to go to Harvard. And then even then, he came back on his first leave of absence, and we taught our seminar again. And after that, we've taken our show on the road. And it has been one of the great blessings of my life. And I'm just very grateful to the opportunity to be back in conversation with Brother Cornel here at this very, very distinguished college.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited. We've been looking forward to this for months, so we're very excited it's finally happening. So, Professor George, you've said that one of the things you like about market economies is that the market economy makes upward social mobility possible. At the same time, you recognize the rates of upward mobility have decreased in recent decades. Mm-hmm. For context, Raj Chetty and his team at Harvard have found that rates of absolute mobility have fallen from approximately 90% of children born in the 1940s to 50% of children born in the 1980s. How do you reconcile this with your support for free markets? And Professor West, do you believe that capitalism has been historically and or currently is a tool for upward social mobility? And we can begin with you, Professor George.
Yeah, okay. So the first thing to understand is that capitalism or socialism, and I have no investment in the term capitalism. What I'm prepared to defend is the market economy. If you want to call that capitalism, that's fine with me. The term seems to me to be a 19th century artifact. The key thing that I want to focus on is the market system of exchange as opposed to a command type economy. But any economic system, whether it's market-based, whether it's socialist, any market system is a system. It's a human artifact. That means it is a means to an end and not an end in itself. And we go completely wrong if we treat these systems as if they are the ends. Because when we do that, then we treat people who are supposed to be the ends to which systems are means, whose flourishing and welfare the systems are supposed to protect and promote. We treat people as essentially things, and systems as if they were persons. We get it exactly backwards. So we should decide our views on economics based on our best assessment in the circumstances, taking into account contingencies, historic circumstances, traditions of the people, understandings. We should design systems as best we can design them, having in mind that the system is supposed to be a means to the flourishing of other human beings, of human beings. It's human beings that are the ends, systems are the means. If the systems are not serving the common good of the persons that they're supposed to serve, then they should be reformed or jettisoned and replaced with a new system. So if I ask myself the question, on the whole, is a market-based economic system better than a command system? Is the wide distribution of public property better, of property better than the public ownership of property? On the whole, I come down in favor of the view that it's better to have a market-based economy if it's a properly regulated market-based economy. I say 2 cheers for capitalism, not 3. 2 cheers for the market economy, not 3. Why not 3? For this simple reason. There is also a downside to the market economy. And that downside has to be taken into account. The market economy serves the human interest when, for example, social mobility is promoted through it. And it's true that historically and across cultures, the introduction of a market system has often lifted large numbers of people out of poverty. That is good. Made possible social mobility, that is good. But if it's not properly regulated, or if the context is one in which you do not have the moral and spiritual values in place that will prevent the market economy from generating market values in the place of moral and spiritual values, then the market, then capitalism becomes a danger to human flourishing, becomes a danger to human well-being. We can get the very things that the late and very great Pope John Paul II worried about in his encyclical called Centesimus Annus, which praised the market economy, but warned about the vices of consumerism, materialism. What C.B. Macpherson, you'll recall, Cornel, the great Canadian political theorist, called possessive individualism, narcissism, the me mentality. Unregulated, the market will sell you anything. If you do not have moral constraints, if you do not have spiritual values, the market will sell you anything. It'll sell you human beings. It'll sell you babies. It'll sell you organs. It'll sell you illicit drugs. Now, some people think there should be a market in illicit drugs. Some people think there should be a market in babies. The Reagan-appointed Judge Richard Posner famously argued in the Wall Street Journal that when it comes to adoption of children, we should have a free market in babies. That seems to me to be absolutely appalling. We need the market, but we need the market properly regulated and informed by moral values so not everything is for sale. Also, there's a danger in the market that there are incentives to produce people, to induce people to want more and more and more, to become acquisitive, to become consumerist. We're incentivized, because we want to sell goods, to persuade people that their futures depend on them having the right tennis shoes, having the right car, having the right clothing. And the market values can then displace the moral and spiritual values. What we should be aiming for is a situation where the market is doing its thing, properly regulated and in the context of surrounding moral values, but not displacing the critical moral and spiritual values that we need if we're to be flourishing human beings, if human dignity is to be respected. So 2 cheers for the market, not 3, but those are 2 real cheers, because the market can be more productive than the command economy, it can be more efficient than the command economy, it can produce liberty in a way that the command economy tends to undermine liberty, and it can produce social mobility. Now, if you want to, just a final point to go to the last question that you raised, you want to know why, in my opinion at least, we've had a decline of social mobility despite having a, quote, free market? It's because it's merely a, quote, free market. So often you have the superficial appearance of a market, but you have, in the reality, oligopolies or even monopolies. And very often, businesses that purport to be operating in a free market are riding on government subsidies, government controls. That's just a pseudo market. I think if we want genuine social mobility, we need a real free market in which you can have real competition, and where those with market share, large amounts of market share, cannot use their power to put into place governmental norms and regulations that impede the challenges to their market share from upstart competitors. Real competition will give you social mobility. Fake competition will undermine social mobility.
Professor West?
Absolutely. No, I think Brother Robbie's right about that. Adam Smith is turning over in his grave when he looks at contemporary predatory capitalist processes in the United States, because his conception of a market had little to do with huge monopolies that have a disproportionate amount of the market, with huge advertisement companies connected with them, shaping the consumer sensibility of the very people you're selling to. That's just greed, just old raw greed that has to be accountable. That's why for me, I don't begin with the ism argument at all. And of course, this is Martin Luther King Jr. time, right? Was he born yesterday? Martin, they said he was a democratic socialist because he worked with the Norman Thomases and the Bernie Sanders and others. But he wasn't an ism man at all. I like to be like Martin. He's a jazz man. And the jazz man is concerned about blues. What is the blues concerned about? Catastrophe. Who's suffering? How come you got all these homeless people here? How come you got all these ghettos and hoods and barrios? How come 62% of fellow citizens in the United States live paycheck to paycheck? And yet you're still generating all this big money at the top. That's hemorrhage. No accountability for greed. And greed shot through all of us. This is a spiritual and a moral issue. Shot through all of us. So when we talk about capitalism, jazz man, concrete, catastrophe, which capitalism you're talking about? You're not talking about the same capitalism in Sweden, where my mother-in-law lives, as opposed to the United States or Argentina or Greenland or Canada. There's no such thing as capitalism in the abstract. It's always rooted in specific traditions and distinctive national traditions. China has markets. They got a repressive communist party that's control of it. They got markets. So what are we talking about? Once we get concrete and say, oh, we're talking about the USA. Oh, now let's say something about American capitalism. Right? My folk were just sold as human beings with slave ships and plantations and lynched. Was that the kind of capitalism we're talking about? Well, no, not that. That's another side of it. No, we're not talking about that at all. We're talking about, what are we talking about then? No, let's keep track of the virtues. Of course markets have virtues. You don't want massive command economies that are unable to generate forms of technological innovation and forms of economic growth. Of course not. When you have huge populations, what other mechanisms will be in place? We've seen the failure of command economies. And those were not democratic socialist economies at all, were they? No, those were communists. And they made their efforts. They were heroic, they failed, and they generated domination and repression. But they did feed a whole lot of their people. And they did generate mass literacy. So we're not talking about communism. Democratic socialists have nothing to point to. There's never been a democratic socialist society. It's just subject matter for a seminar. I'm not against that. We got to talk about, use our imaginations in seminars. But the point is, if we're talking about capitalism, let's talk about U.S. capitalism today. Oh my God, Wall Street, Silicon, big tech, professional managerial class winning over and over again, but the masses of working people and poor people pushed aside, and 2 out of 5 black children living in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. Catastrophe, blues sensibility. We're concerned about that for what? Moral and spiritual reasons. Because as a human being, we ought to be concerned about folk catching hell, especially living in the richest nation in the history of the world. But that does not mean then that we don't have difference and overlap. Brother Robbie is anti-poverty the way I am. He wants to use markets. I want to use markets and government. He wants to use government and markets, but we have different emphasis and different weights of those. But most importantly, and of course he's a Christian brother, so he's tied to some blues sensibility. Because anybody who has the audacity to call themselves Christian in the 21st century and still believe that love for the least of these, for those friends for known called the wretched of the earth, is an integral part of who you are as a human being. Anybody who's Judaic, the way Abraham Joshua Hester, I know Sister Susanna, magnificent daughter of Abraham. Y'all see her, give her a hug for me. Teaching right here, Dartmouth. Hesed, spreading loving kindness to orphan and widow and fatherless and motherless and subjugated and colonized and demonized. Yes, I'm a follower of Judaism. Oh, what audacity. I'm a follower of Jesus. What audacity. That means, lo and behold, you're getting beyond the isms debate. You're concerned about how concrete human beings are wrestling with catastrophic conditions. And you're improvisational, just like a jazz woman or a jazz man, which means you're not locked into dogma. You want to be flexible and fluid and use any insight you can to help empower folk whose dignity is not being affirmed and whose humanity is being violated. So it's open-ended. We're not talking about people coming in with their own prejudgments of what socialism is and what capitalism is. No, you come in with an open perception and open mind because people are suffering and something must be done, and we've got to learn how to see it and feel it and talk about it and intervene and put our bodies where our voices are and go to jail, and some of us will die for that. That's Martin. That's Heschel. That's Fannie Lou Hamer. That's Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs II. Class of 1852, Dartmouth. 3rd black graduate of Dartmouth, whose son would found FAMU. Somebody tell me who FAMU is. Florida A&M University. Dartmouth connection, concerned with the least of these. Courage, commitment, witness. Of course, our dear sister Maria Coe, who's president of Black Alumni at Dartmouth, was my executive assistant. I want to mention her because I know she's got this Dartmouth connection. That's real. But it brings it home to us because we're talking about something that's profoundly humanistic. We want to be unsettled in our minds and touched in our souls and empowered in our hearts and bodies so that when we leave, we're stronger forces for good after a political union. It's not just spectacle. It's not just spectatorial. It's something that we are wrestling with, and we come out, we hope, with ways of seeing and feeling and acting. and loving and having fun too. Because what I love about Brother Robbie is that he not just plays magnificent banjo, but he says what he means and he means what he says, so I don't have to worry about the posing and posturing. You see, one of the problems we have these days in our decadent culture is that people tend to just want to say something to be accepted or make a rhetorical gesture just to be approved and don't say what's in your heart and mind. You can't be a blues woman or a jazz man if you're not speaking from your heart and soul and playing from your heart and soul. It's hard to be for real in this superficial culture. It's so easy to wear the mask. It's good to see the young folk here too. Oh, yeah, look at those smiles too. My God, my God, my God. It's a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing. Because so much of this for them. Being for real, being honest, being concerned about treating people right. That's a beautiful thing. We're losing that in the culture. And Brother Robbie is for real in that sense. He really is. And that's one of the reasons why I love my brother.
So I want to expand on something you mentioned about your Christian faith. You're both devout Christians, and you've commented about how your faith has influenced your economic perspectives. I went deep into the archives for this one, but at Clemson, I think in like early 2010s, you were giving a similar talk, and you said, quote, "It appears to me that Christian socialists confuse principle with prudence, and they got prudence wrong," end quote.
Did I say that?
You did.
That's good.
And on the other side of the spectrum, Professor West, you said in an interview...
You do some good homework, brother. I appreciate that. Yeah. This brother's serious.
Professor West, you said in an interview that from a normative perspective, it is, quote, absolutely right, end quote, to embrace socialism based on the teachings of Jesus in the early church. So I'm curious, what are these disagreements in your
that's me right there.
Yeah. So what are these,
that's me right there. No, I'm going.
What are these differences in your, approaches based on your faith?
Okay. So this question, Mac, is going to give me an opportunity to bite some bullets, which I want to bite, because I want those who are considering whether they want to share my view that basically a market-based economy is the way to go. I want you to know what you're buying here. I want you to buy it, but I want you to know what you're buying. When I arrived in Oxford, in England, as a doctoral student in fall of 1981, I was in a country that understood itself to be a democratic socialist country after many years of labor government, but one that had fallen into a kind of economic decay. So much in British society didn't work. There was not anything approaching social mobility. Historically, Britain has not had the kind of social mobility, but it's still in some ways a quasi-feudal system. Still a class-based system. But the economy had really gotten itself into bad shape. And the British people elected Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher is more of a libertarian than I am. She is more inclined to believe than I am that a market economy will itself generate positive moral and social values among the people and broader civil liberties. I'm more skeptical about those things than she is. But she brought in an economic program that did revive the British economy, revitalized key British institutions, that made forms of social mobility possible for many British citizens that had been, for all intents and purposes, impossible before that. But, and here comes the bullet biting, there were also dislocations. Market systems create dislocations. Competition has good effects, but it can also have the effect of undermining the economic base of certain communities. So, for example, Mrs. Thatcher insisted on buying coal at the best market price. Basically, that meant, for practical purposes, buying coal from Poland rather than from Wales. Well, you can imagine what happened to the coal industry. And I myself come from West Virginia. Both my grandfathers were coal miners. I know about coal country. I know about coal communities. I know about the kinds of people that are formed in those communities. I know the virtues and I know the vices. But this was an old community built on a coal economy in Wales that was no longer competitive. It simply was not competitive. And that meant literally thousands of workers being thrown out of mining jobs. And mining, this is true when I grew up in West Virginia as well, is a boom and bust business. I can tell by what's going on the streets when I return to West Virginia, whether we're in a boom or a bust. If I see bass boats being hauled behind trucks, if I see off-road vehicles, I know the mines are working. If I don't, I know that the mines are not working, and there are a lot of people out of work. Well, that noble and valuable community could not be sustained. Its economic base could not sustain it because Mrs. Thatcher was buying coal at the market price on the market. Now, her response to this was, let them get other jobs. But of course, it's not that easy. You can't suddenly get other jobs. She thought, at least in the short to medium term, that we could retool these workers as tech workers. But again, that's easier said than done. There were real costs paid by real human beings, as well as real benefits given to or acquired by real human beings. There's no such thing as a system that has all benefits and no costs. Now, I'm biting the bullet by saying I think she was right and that cost was worth paying. But it was a real cost to real people. The second thing that I found admirable about Mrs. Thatcher's approach, and this I do commend, and I think you need a market economy to do it, a real market economy, not a fake one, and that is widespread ownership of property. Beginning, yes, with real property, that is home ownership, but more broadly, investments in companies, for example, equity shares. I think the widespread ownership of property is good for the entire society. It's good for everybody. But if you have a market, you're going to get something else, and you're going to have to decide whether you think it is of no significance or something that's very bad, and that is economic inequality. Even very large economic inequality. Some people think that massive economic inequality, some people have $230 billion, and other people have the tiniest tiny fraction of a fraction of that, is itself, I think the word that's typically used, obscene. Some people think that equality itself is an intrinsic value. Now, if you think that inequality, especially large inequalities, are obscene, or if you think that equality is an intrinsic value, then that's going to count against a market system. It just will. How do I handle that? How do I think about that? Well, I don't think economic equality is intrinsically valuable. Now, I think the principle of the equality of all human persons in dignity, the basic dignity of all human beings, that all human beings are bearers of profound, inherent, and equal dignity, that's something that's intrinsically valuable. But I don't think that there's any intrinsic value in everybody having roughly the same amount of wealth. If you do, you're going to think differently about markets. I don't. So I'm not put off in principle by the inequality generated by markets, so long as it's a fair and genuinely competitive market system. What I care about is it generating social mobility, and is it generating enough income for everybody with a proper government safety net to keep everybody out of poverty. That's what I care about. And you asked about being a Christian. Okay. Well, the final point about that. How does that relate? That's supposed to be the question. Yeah. Okay. That goes to that principle that I talked about a moment ago. The principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. That's the principle of all sound morality. That's the basic principle of all sound morality. I yield to no one in my admiration of the great Greek and Roman thinkers, the thinkers of antiquity. If I have a competitor, it's only Cornel in my admiration for them. And much that they taught us, Aristotle in particular, but Plato, and of course through Plato we have the teachings of Socrates, Roman thinkers like Cicero. We learn an enormous amount about the moral life from these great thinkers. But there is one defect that is remedied by the great Hebrew revelation that's then taken up into not only Judaism but Christianity, and that is the principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family, the one that's articulated in the very first book of, the very first chapter actually, the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, where we're taught that man, though fashioned from the mere dust of the earth, is made nevertheless in the very image and likeness of the divine creator and ruler of all that is, the very image and likeness of God, the imago Dei principle. So that's my core principle. That's what leads me to think I should either be a socialist or a believer in markets, depending on which one, all things considered, in the end, given the trade-offs, will comport best with the principle of inherent dignity. What will best promote human flourishing?
Professor West.
Absolutely. And my quote had something to do with Jesus. What was that?
You said that it's, in a normative sense, it's
Yes.
absolutely right to embrace socialism, again, an ism, I apologize,
Right.
based on the teachings of Jesus in the early church.
Yeah, again, I had in mind a particular example or exemplars of the ism that we were talking about. Because, see, all of us have to be very candid in terms of just how wretched we really are as a species. Right? I mean, the history of the species is the history of organized greed and weaponized hatred and domination and subjugation. You just have moments of interruption. And if that's the case, and that cuts across our hearts as well as our societies, that's the case, you have to decide, okay, how do I become an interruption? How do I somehow make space for the hesed, for the love, for the justice, for the kindness, for the sweetness in a world that is so cold and cruel? Now, that's a certain philosophical anthropology, but that's my starting point, just as a Christian. And so then the question becomes, well, in my own shaping and molding, in terms of the West family, in terms of Shiloh Baptist Church and the Black Panther Party where I worked, in terms of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and Fannie Lou Hamer's and others, those who were concerned about the catastrophes tended to be more people who talked whatever ism they used. It was a socialism-ism. It wasn't a whole lot of capitalists running around, especially from the well-to-do classes, concerned about poor people. I didn't see them. And I come from people who've been enslaved 244 years, and Jim Crow and Jane Crow for 100 years. That's neo-slavery. And when I was born, 80% of black folk living in poverty. I just didn't see them. It may have been in the textbook somewhere, but it didn't trickle down. So if Martin Luther King said, well, I'm for democratic socialism as a Christian, I said, I better listen to Martin. I better listen to Ella Baker. I better listen to Fannie Lou Hamer. I better listen to Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas was a vanilla brother out there getting beat up every day, trying to organize black and white workers in the South, Jim Crow South. Friends getting lynched. Wow, I got to listen to these folk. Not because of ism, not because they just talking. That's the life they're living. And to be a Christian, or at least to be a follower of a Palestinian Jew named Jesus coming out of prophetic Judaism in the midst of a Roman Empire in which he overthrows the money tables with 300 Roman troops protecting the temple, the largest edifice east of Rome, and then crucified because he turns those tables over. Dang, this brother, he must really be committed to poor people. Well, you have to be God too. Oh, Lord, we're getting theological. We won't go there right now. But he's showing by his actions that he loves. Just like Mom showing y'all. Love. Concrete as a heart attack, right? Absolutely. Jesus is showing that. So the question becomes, if capitalists want to make the case, where's your mass movement to eliminate poverty? Where's your mass movement to make sure workers are treated with dignity? Now, you do have such examples. G.K. Chesterton, you mentioned distributors. Chesterton says what? I'm an Anglican, and then I'm a Catholic, but I'm a Christian. And as a Christian, I affirm precisely what Brother Robbie said, Imago Dei. And I worship a God whose back was against the wall on the cross and died for everyone, but there because I've been criminalized by the Roman Empire for being in solidarity with poor people, not because I hate rich people, because I hate greed, because I hate indifference to people who are suffering. See, that's the Jesus that I encountered in my own life. and I decided to follow and be faithful unto death. It ain't a question of popularity. It's a question of trying to follow that Jesus who has changed one's life in such a way that you're willing to not just talk about the cross, but bear the cross and be willing to die on that cross because you got something else coming. So when I said follower of Jesus in that sense, it's a very visceral kind of thing. It's not just abstract, cerebral, and theological in an abstract way. No. It's bearing the cross. And that cross signifies unarmed truth, and condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And it signifies unapologetic love of everybody. And justice is what love looks like in public. Any justice, that's only justice, soon degenerates into something less than justice. That's Brother Ryan Home Niebuhr. That's my vanilla brother. And he wrote that as a Christian socialist, but mainly as a Christian, as a Christian thinker and as a Christian follower of Jesus. It's 1932, in Moral Man and Moral Society. He changed his mind and became a mainstream liberal, but everybody has a tilt towards selling out.
So, Professor West.
He became a member of the establishment, and so, all of a sudden, Jesus on the cross, a little bit too much for him right now. We won't get into that right now.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of points on what West said. So I'm going to guess that distributism is probably not a well-known economic philosophy.
Right.
Am I right
Worth
about
talking
that?
about, though. It's very
Yeah,
important.
so it was the philosophy of economic relations that was promoted by G.K. Chesterton and his associates. And it reflects reflection on the question, where should property be concentrated, if it should be concentrated? The socialist says concentrated in the hands of the public as a whole, which means for all intents and purposes the hands of the state.
The state, yeah.
Or the libertarian says, or not necessarily the libertarian, that's unfair, but there are some people who say, well, it should be concentrated but in private hands. Distributism is the idea that it shouldn't be concentrated, that what we should aim for is the widespread distribution of property. That was the aspect of Mrs. Thatcher's philosophy that I mentioned a moment ago that I thought was valuable and desirable. You want people to be invested in the society. You want them to be property owners. You want them to have something of their own. You don't want it in the hands of the government, but you don't want it also concentrated oligopolistically or monopolistically. It's the widespread ownership of property. Second point very quickly. Now, I bet everybody has heard of Alexander the Great, right? Everybody's heard of Alexander. Yes, everybody's heard. Now, how many people think that Alexander the Great was really great and should be emulated? Not a single, oh, there is somebody, okay, somebody up there, okay. For most of human history in most places, most times, many, many more hands would go up. The vast majority of people would say, yeah, he was really great. He was able to work his will. He was able to conquer and dominate. He was able to win battles. He was able to take things over. He was able to rule. Why? How did we get from there to a room full of Dartmouth students and others and friends in 2025 where nobody thinks Alexander the Great is really great? What the heck happened? The widespread adoption, at least in theory, whether we believe it in our hearts and really willing to stick with it and live it out, the adoption of the principle of the Imago Dei. That's it. This is what the Christian Revolution was fundamentally all about, that it's not Alexander who tramples on people, who works his will, who conquers and dominates that's great. It's those who reach out in hesed, in loving kindness, who treat the first as if they're last and the last as if they're first, who reach out for the least and the last and the lost. They are they're people who are truly great. They are the people to be emulated. I cannot stress enough how revolutionary that is. It's very well articulated for anybody who wants to read more about the historical development of that in the recent book called Dominion. I've forgotten the author's name. Can anybody remember it? Tom Holland. Tom Holland. Yeah, Tom Holland, his book Dominion.
All right. Well, we have about 10 minutes left before audience Q&A. So very briefly, I kind of want to stay in this theme. And Professor West, you said that there's, quote, absolutely, end quote, space today for a revival of Christian socialism, noting that it may take place in a deeply religious context, not in the democratic socialists of America. Furthermore, The Atlantic published an essay titled Cornel West on why the left needs Jesus. And so do you believe the infusion of your Christian faith with this message has been well received by the left today? And for Professor George, how do you view the current status of the conservative movement's relationship with Christianity and capitalism? We can start with Professor West.
When was that first quote actually done? I know it wasn't last week. How long ago was that?
I think it was in 2022 or 2023.
Oh, just 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You're allowed to change your mind.
Oh, absolutely, because I could definitely be wrong about a number of things. No, I'm just convinced now that those persons who are substantively and seriously concerned about speaking certain truths among the vulnerable are in a very weak and feeble position, because it's so difficult to translate it into organizational capacity. And without translating it into organizational capacity, it's hard to envision how you can bring enough power and pressure to bear on the powerful, tied with the lust and the greed and the contempt and the arrogance and the haughtiness. They're still human beings. I'm not in any way saying that they're devils. I'm saying they have devilish proclivities, just like all of us. You see. And this has been the history of the tradition that produced me. You see. Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs II at Dartmouth in 1852. How many folk here at Dartmouth at that time wanted the abolition of slavery? It's like the number of black folk in the National Hockey League. Even the president, Nathan Lord, at that time, was an abolitionist for a while, changes his mind and becomes pro-slavery. But they become close friends, and that same president will speak and give the ordination sermon for Jonathan after he goes to Princeton Seminary as a Presbyterian minister. Friendship, deeper than politics, but they clashing like I don't know what. Dartmouth's own history. We've got to be willing to be able to take a stand and straighten our backs up, even in it's a moment in which it seems as if things are hopeless. That's what the blues is all about. Nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's B.B. King. He's the king of the blues. Cutting against the grain, in the world but not of the world. And that's true for every Christian. How in the world are you going to be a Christian in this cold and cruel world and think that somehow they shall know you by your love and joy? They shall know you by your willingness to sacrifice and empty yourself when everybody's concerned about their career, or most people concerned about their career and so forth? Yes, weak and feeble. So I would want to change that or say I was wrong. It's much weaker and feeble, but it should make us stronger and more determined, precisely because we refuse to give in, we refuse to give up, and we refuse to sell out. And in this moment of Trump, we need it even more. Because I think one thing we can all agree, to go from George Washington to Donald Trump is not an affirmation of Charles Darwin thinking that evolution produces something better. He just doesn't. This is nadir. This is low point, spiritually, morally. We're not talking about politics yet, just spiritually and morally. Now, somebody wants to argue that we're at a moment of tremendous spiritual and moral awakening because Brother Trump is on his way to the White House. I say, get off the crack pipe now.
Professor George.
I could be wrong, though. I mean, I could be wrong.
I have a serious concern about the conservative movement. I like to think of myself as a conservative, as a person in good standing in the conservative movement. My friends who are sympathetic to President Trump do not consider me to be a faithful conservative.
You stood tall against Trump.
Yeah, well, Try to be faithful, Cornel.
No,
Just try to be faithful.
I've been praying for you too.
So I need it. I need it. Keep it up. Keep it up. You keep your eye on him. Make sure he's praying for me. And what am I worried about? I'm worried about losing our grounding. I'm worried about the whole country doing it. I'm also worried about the conservative movement doing this, losing our grounding in our commitment to the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. What I'm worried about is conservatism moving in the direction of the abandonment of that principle. Now, what follows from that principle concretely, morally, when we try to apply it, and then when we move to the policy dimension, all that is debatable in many ways. Sometimes it's not obvious where we should be on a particular issue. Some questions should be fairly obvious, like slavery. If you believe in profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family, you should see that slavery is wrong. Yet, people who were serious about their Christian faith, and in so many other ways were good Christians, embraced slavery. So that tells you something. It tells you something about our fallibility. It tells you something about our condition. And that's just not them, those other people. That's right. All of us have that same weakness, those same proclivities that Professor West was talking. He, being Protestant, probably describes them more colorfully than I as a Catholic do. But human fallenness, even if we don't go to the Calvinist extreme in our description of it, our fallenness is a real thing. So we have trouble applying the principle and sticking with the principle. My worry right now is about the abandonment of the principle altogether. I probably shouldn't even mention names of institutions or people that worry me, but if any of you are familiar with these movements out there to de-Christianize conservatism, does the label Bronze Age pervert mean anything to anybody? I'm glad if it doesn't, but that's a well-known, I'm not sure if it's a website or what it is, that thinks that conservatism's embracing of Christian principles is just a mistake. There's a neo-Nietzschean movement that attracts
within
especially, within conservatives, that attracts especially young men. Attracts especially young men. That Christianity is soft, that it's soft-minded, that it's feminized. Those, I think, are really bad. Now, they're very small within the conservative movement now, but you can see their ripple effects. And people who aren't all the way there, in some cases, are part way there. And it plays itself out sometimes in ways that are, very unhappy, where legitimate concerns, for example, about the bad consequences of everybody for illegal immigration become now a turning against immigrants as such, or a turning against our long-standing and very valuable commitment to providing safe havens for genuine asylum seekers. So, I think we just have to be careful about this. And I think those of us who do believe in the basic biblical principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family have to fight for it within whatever communities, including communities of belief, including political communities that we belong to. I hope there are people on the left who are willing to fight for that on the left. I sure want people like myself on the right to fight for it on the right. That should be the common. We're going to disagree in the application in many cases, but that should be the common ground. If we lose it on either the right or the left or both, we're in big, big trouble. It's a pretty short road back to thinking Alexander the Great was really great.
Well, with that being said, I first want to thank Professor George and Professor West for an incredible moderated discussion. Can we give them a hand, please?
No, thank you.
We thank you, though, brother. We thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You were conducting.
For audience Q&A, if you'd like to ask a question, please come to the aisle and form a line behind one of our DPU team members. They should be, in the aisle. We have approximately 20 minutes, so to get to as many people as possible, questions typically start with who, what, where, why, and how. So let's avoid the personal stories. We can start with you, Pari.
Yeah. Yes, go right ahead.
Thank you both. I have a question for Professor George. You mentioned that capitalism or free market is able to create equality of dignity and humanity and liberty without creating economic inequality, without creating economic equality. And I want to dig deeper into that. So in today's world, when one's self-worth and dignity and mental health and ability to choose is so tied to one's economic resources, how you can possibly separate those two kinds of equality?
Oh, okay. So I do think a certain amount of economic prosperity is required out of respect for basic human dignity. That much is true. And that's why I want a system that does generate social mobility, makes it possible for people who are at the bottom end to rise up through the system. I think that's been the best part of our experience on the economic side in the United States. I think that's part of our history we can be proud of. There's much in our history not to be proud of. That's one thing we can be proud of. I mentioned earlier that both of my grandfathers were coal miners. I'm McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. I bless our, that's not me. I didn't do that myself. A whole system made it possible for that to happen. I want that to be possible for more people. And it worries me that it seems to be possible now for fewer people. So that's my worry. So we do need, this may be not quite the right way to put it, but a minimum. And that's why I also support a public safety net. I do think that the bulk of the work when it comes to making sure that we've got at least a minimum of health, education, and welfare falls to the private sphere. The principle that's known as the principle of subsidiarity, relying where possible on private initiative, voluntary associations, churches, ethnic self-help groups, these kinds of things, fraternal organizations. I think they have to provide the bulk of that, but there is a role for government there. This is why, again, I'm not a strict libertarian, and I would not favor eliminating the social safety net. So that far we can go. Where I don't go along with those of the more socialist point of view is in seeing economic equality itself as something intrinsically valuable or economic inequality as itself something intrinsically evil. Have I made myself clear? Have I at least answered your question? I don't care, whether you agree or not. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Awesome.
I mean, I do care whether you agree, but what's important to me is that I haven't dodged your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Michael?
Thanks. My question is for both professors. Do you believe that climate change is one of the most important, if not the most important issue of our times? And why do you believe that your preferred economic framework is more prepared to deal with it?
It's a powerful question, brother. I think that ecological catastrophe and nuclear catastrophe are the two major threats to the possibility of our species preserving itself over time and space. Neither system's prepared. I don't know of a country that's actually prepared. That's not good news. But I know people who are fighting. And some of us are going to fight, but there's a connection between the ecological catastrophe when you got the fossil fuel companies driven by greed and short-term profit. There's a connection between a nuclear catastrophe when you actually see the role that the foreign policy elites play and therefore think that somehow a life in one part of the world is less than a life in another part of the world. Life in Gaza has less value than a life somewhere else. A life in Haiti has less value than somewhere else. That's how you get nuclear catastrophe. You think that somehow you can treat these folk this way, drop the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and so forth and so on, and it's not going to blow back on you. That's a moral and spiritual issue too. But it doesn't mean we give up. I mean, I'm with Robbie in that regard. But I think we have to be very truthful about the degree to which we are so thoroughly ill-prepared, or as Christians would say, coming out of the 6th chapter of Ephesians, our armor is so thin and weak at the moment. Put the whole armor on. I don't know of a nation or a country that put the whole armor on when it comes to ecological catastrophe, a nuclear catastrophe.
I do worry about nuclear catastrophe a lot because it could happen at any moment. We don't know what the trigger could be. Probably only Cornel and myself in this room are old enough. Maybe there are a few others of our
I see your brother
of
up
our
there.
vintage.
He got a little gray. The brother got a little gray. He got a little gray. He's more handsome than we are, but he got a little gray. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
there you go. Well, the three of us can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was, to quote Brother Cornel, real as a heart attack.
Oh, yes.
Most people in the country thought at any moment it could all be gone.
That was it.
At any moment.
That's
You remember
right.
that?
Oh, I
when we
was,
were kids?
absolutely.
Right. And that could be at any moment now. Right? I mean, think of how many now nuclear countries with actual nuclear weapons we have. I'm less concerned about climate change. I think it's a real issue, but I don't think it's something that we need to panic about. If you're familiar with the work of Steve Koonin, the physicist Steve Koonin from NY, is this ringing a bell to you? So if you look at Koonin's work, he's a very respected scientist. I couldn't hear.
He said Princeton physicist?
No, NYU.
NYU.
Stephen
He's at
Koonin.
NYU.
So I think he's got a very balanced view of the subject. I'm not an expert myself, so I'm looking at it from a layman's point of view. I think his advice is to take steps, but don't panic. The real challenge on the climate front is international cooperation. That's the problem, because we can only legislate within our individual nations. It's going to take international cooperation, and there is no, and I think it would be a bad idea to try to create, an international legislative body. So we're going to have to work by treaties, conventions, other international agreement instruments, and that's tough going. Now, as far as which economic system is concerned, I don't think you can resolve the question of how much government and how much market by saying with any kind of confidence which will better handle climate issues. I think there are pros and cons in both directions.
Is he a climate scientist?
Yeah, Koonin's a climate scientist.
For BP?
I'm sorry?
For BP?
For BP? Not as far as I know. He's at NYU.
employed by BP from 2004 to 2009. Okay.
Okay,
All right, we're
fine,
going to go
yeah,
over to the next person.
Yeah, can I say a word about that? Can I say a word about that? It's very tempting to suppose that you can discredit someone by just linking them to certain economic interests or political interests or whatever. Don't go there. Read the work, whether it's in philosophy, no matter what the issue is, whether it's climate, whether it's the tax system. Read the arguments on the competing sides and assess them and decide for yourself where the truth lays. Don't try to say, oh, this guy belongs to that camp or this guy's in the pay of that guy. Read the arguments. The arguments either succeed or fail. They're either good or bad. Do it on the merits.
Ari?
This is a question for Dr. West. This is happening in the aftermath of the destruction of Gaza, which has been perpetrated by a society for the first 40 years of its founding that was a socialist nation in the Middle East. So how can democratic socialism cultivate those moral values, that imago Dei, across national boundaries and across kind of warring nation states?
Absolutely, brother. That's why every ism is, for me, under the cross, unarmed truth and unconditional love. Every flag is under truth, justice, and love. And it's by your fruits you shall know them. By your fruits you shall know them. If a socialist society, a nation, engages in ethnic cleansing and genocide, whatever it is, then you have a major moral condemnation. And you have opposition against it. If a capitalist society does it, same is true. And that's true across the board. Elites who are Christian doing the same thing. They could be Muslim mullahs in Iran, treating our Iranian young sisters as if they're less than human. It could be in Uganda treating black gays and lesbians like they're less than human. We have to have a moral consistency across the board, and then we have to have an analysis. And you talk about the 40 years and the occupation, absolutely. I mean, that's a whole different subject matter. We'd have to spend a whole lot of time on that. But we had to tell that truth, and we had to be willing to tell that truth, no matter how unpopular it is.
All right, this will actually be our last question. I'm sad, but we are running out of time, so sadly this is our
Oh,
last
but we can't
question.
get in a few more, though.
Well, maybe we can do rapid fire.
Rapid
maybe?
fire.
All right, let's do rapid
Brother Robbie
fire.
and I will be real.
All right. This is for both of you, but largely in the context of what Professor George had said when he talked about the UK and sort of the way in which people in Wales, like
Yeah.
a less industrialized economy or less, I guess, technological economy, they were sort of dispossessed by that transition, and then like the technological training failed. How in
Well, it didn't completely fail, but it did not immediately solve the problem, that's for sure. Yeah.
So in a global economy where there's differing levels of development and modernization, industrialization, how do we ensure that our economic policy doesn't create sort of ripple effects that sort of illusion other people? in
Very
other
intelligent
countries?
question, and I wish I had an answer to that. There will be ripple effects. I mean, all I think we can do is do our best to think of ways that we can lessen the negative impacts, remediate the situation, provide alternative forms of employment, get serious about it, and not just write people off. Say, well, okay, then the former miners in Wales and their families will be on welfare. We'll provide welfare. They should, then we'll get the big benefit of the market economy, and we'll just forget about those people. They'll be caught by the safety net. That's not the way to go. And that is not what Mrs. Thatcher herself proposed. She really thought you could fairly quickly transform the economy, especially by training the former miners and people who would have in the future been miners to be tech specialists. And that just takes a lot more time, I think, than people at the time, understandably, but nevertheless, a lot more time and effort than people at the time thought it would. And we should learn from that.
Would you care to respond to that?
Yeah,
Professor West?
Well, I'm trying to be real short. But Robbie and I have a disagreement about Sister Thatcher. I was there with Arthur Scargill. We got crushed trying to defend the trade
Scargill
union
was
movement.
the miners'
He was the
union
brother,
president.
absolutely. I was there for 3 weeks, and we got crushed. Because if you're going to deregulate and marketize and do it in such a way that the benefits are not fairly distributed vis-a-vis the workers, and the unions are one of the ways in which the workers can at least have a chance in collective bargaining context to ensure as the profits go up, the profits are more fairly distributed. And that's not the case. She then becomes an exemplar of a neoliberal, not ism, but neoliberal move in Britain, which is an assault on working people's possibilities unless those working peoples are included in the benefits as productivity escalates. And we've seen that in the United States in the last 40 years, the redistribution of wealth from working people to the well-to-do. And the challenge to each and every one of you, because most of you all are on your way to the professional managerial class. That's the class that won. That's the class that benefited. That's the class that doesn't, for the most part, have to worry about paycheck to paycheck, 62% of your fellow citizens. No, it's the professional managerial class that benefited from these neoliberal policies with Thatcher, with Reagan and Clinton and Obama and so forth. And therefore, Thatcher for me is, I could just see her right now. We had these struggles in London, though, brother. I'm telling you. But I mean, that we don't have time for that. Now we're running late. But I just have a different view than my brother on that when it comes to working people not being treated fairly.
Pari?
How do you, in today's political climate, walk into a room with someone who's of the opposite political persuasion and still believe they're a good person?
How can you, I'm sorry?
How do you walk into a room in today's political climate with someone who's completely opposite, on the opposite side of the political spectrum from you, and still believe they're a good person?
Okay, all right. There are very few things we know for sure. One of them, each and every one of us knows. You tell anybody out there, if I'm speaking falsely, you tell me. Every single one of us knows that he or she is fallible. Any exceptions? Anybody infallible? If Pope Francis walks in on me. No?
Some of us have questions about the Pope. Just go right ahead.
So we know our fallibility. Now let me ask you this. Are we fallible only on the minor, trivial, superficial issues in life? Or are we also fallible on the big, important, profound questions? Questions of meaning and value, questions of human nature, the human good, human rights, human dignity, human destiny. I think we'd all agree we're fallible even on the big questions. Now that means we have a very good incentive to listen to our critics because we really might be wrong. In the small group meeting we had before this, I called attention, those of you who are Jewish or have attended Yom Kippur services, the Kol Nidra service at Yom Kippur, will remember I called attention to that part of the Yom Kippur service where we in the congregation, we beat our breasts and we go through the sins and we confess our sins. Yom Kippur is the Jewish Day of Atonement. We have cheated. We have lied. We have committed adultery. We have borne false witness against our neighbor. Then there is one that goes, we are zealots for bad causes. Those of you who have been to Kol Nidra, do you remember? We are zealots for bad causes. Nobody sets out to be a zealot for a bad cause. When you're zealous for a cause, it's because you believe it's a good cause. But the great wisdom of that great Jewish tradition has captured this point about our fallibility. So we've got to be self-critical. We need intellectual humility. We need to be willing to be challenged, have our views scrutinized. And we must never take a challenge, no matter how deeply held our view is, no matter how identity-forming our view is. We must never treat it as a personal assault. It's not. It's an attempt to change our minds on an idea, on a belief. Now, we might be right. You shouldn't just bend over, just collapse in the front of an argument. Assess the argument. Again, to go back to what I said earlier, take the arguments on the merits. Listen to the best that's to be said on this side and the best that's to be said on that side. Factor everything else. Who's making the arguments is irrelevant. Is the argument good or is it bad? And one final thing. I doubt that there's anybody in the room, again, correct me, who's ever learned from somebody they were shouting at. No. We only learn when we're willing to listen to the other guy.
Yeah, just very briefly, though, brother, that's a very moving question. I think it's very important to always remember that a person's humanity is not fully exhausted by the political views that they have. So you're able to stay in contact with people's humanity, even when you have deep disagreement. You see, if Trump walked through the door right now, and he said, Brother West, you've been calling me a gangster for 8 years. I said, yeah, that's right. You got the right, brother. But I'd ask him, how's your son doing? Because I don't want your son treated the way you too often treat some of these immigrants on the border. Your son has a dignity and a sanctity I'll never lose sight of because he's made in the image of a loving and mighty God. Now, I would ask him about his mama, but I know she's dead. But if somebody 20-some years old, right wing, how's your mama doing? Well, Brother West, I appreciate you asking me that. She's sick now. Well, you Christian, let's have a prayer, man. Well, I thought you were left wing, and I don't give a goddamn about what wing you are. I'm concerned about your mama. All of a sudden, no guarantee, but you stayed in contact with their humanity, separate from their political views. That's very important in terms of ensuring that you don't get devoured by the same kind of hatred and contempt. And that's part of what Martin King was all about, too, but he doesn't do it all by himself. It's a rich tradition. But that, to me, is very important in terms of the life that we have to live. We're not here that long anyway. And what kind of integrity, honesty, decency, love, kindness, sweetness, joy will you leave? That's, I think, one way of responding to your profound question, though, brother. But don't you give up. That's the crucial thing, man. Now, if they have, guns and drones and things, you got to get out of there. Because they'll shoot you down. You don't want to get shot now. I'm not asking you to take this thing too far.
Well, with that, we're actually going to end the discussion. So thank you so much.
Oh, that was rich, my brother. Lord have mercy.
Thank you all for a truly
very
fantastic
much.
event.
Thank you.
Please stay seated for a
the way
moment,
that you
guys.
just talk and profess. It's amazing. And
Before we
thank you so much,
close-
Professor.
Please take a few moments to answer the poll here so we can see if anyone's mind has changed as a result of this debate. And while you're all doing that, I again want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Professors West and George for being great debate partners, and I want to thank the Office of the President for its continuous support. Lastly, I just want to use this opportunity to announce our next event. On Sunday, February 2nd, we will be hosting an expert debate on U.S. aid to Ukraine, featuring journalist and podcaster Eli Lake and radio host and author Scott Horton. So please fill out this poll, and let's have a look at the responses. So, With that said, the results of our poll are in. 34.4% of you now believe that capitalism best promotes economic justice, individual freedom, and social responsibility, while 65.7% of you disagree. I'll ask that you all stay seated while our guests exit the room. And once again, please join me in giving Professor West and Professor George a round of applause. Thank you.